Hello everyone. Let's subscribe to Relationship Stories before we forget. You won't want to miss what's coming up next.
A desperate wife, an affair that shattered lives, and a husband's dark ritual that brought ruin. When love turns to hate, and betrayal leads to vengeance, can anyone escape the consequences of a curse cast in anger? The air was thick with tension that seemed to have seeped into the walls of my small office. It had been raining for days, with clouds casting a perpetual gray gloom over the city, and I hadn't seen the sun for what felt like forever. I was sifting through some old case files when the door burst open. She came in like a hurricane, her face a twisted mask of anxiety and pain. Her hair was a mess, her eyes wide and glassy, and it was clear she hadn't slept in days. "Detective Ethan Harper, you have to help me. It's murder," she screamed, her voice breaking as she spoke. Startled, I put the files down and stood up. "Ma'am, take a breath." "Murder? Who's been murdered?" I asked, gesturing to the worn-out chair in front of my desk. "It's my husband, Nathan. He did this. He's trying to kill Eric, my friend." She stumbled over the word, her face turning red as she realized how this sounded. I knew this woman, Eleanor Carlisle. She'd been in my office just a few weeks ago with a different request. She had wanted help obtaining a restraining order against her husband, Nathan Carlisle. At the time, she claimed her husband was emotionally unstable and had become erratic after discovering her affair. She'd feared for her safety and that of her lover, Eric, but now she was talking about murder. I sighed and sat back down, motioning for her to do the same. "Eleanor, I understand you're upset, but you need to calm down and explain what's happening." She collapsed into the chair, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face. "It's Eric. He's dying, and I know Nathan is behind it. He put a curse on him," she whispered. "A curse." I could hardly believe what I was hearing, but as I looked at her, I could see the fear in her eyes. She believed it with every fiber of her being. "A curse?" I repeated, incredulous. "Eleanor, curses aren't real. Whatever is happening to Eric, it must be a medical condition." She shook her head violently, her tears falling faster now. "You don't understand. Nathan warned me. He said if I didn't end things with Eric, there would be consequences. He said he'd make him suffer, make him pay for what he'd done. I thought he was just angry. I didn't think he'd actually do something like this. But then Eric started getting sick and the doctors, they can't explain it. They say his body is shutting down, but they don't know why." She took a shaky breath and continued, her voice barely a whisper. "Nathan called me last week. He said it's done. The curse is cast. And now Eric is in the hospital dying, and it's all my fault." I leaned back in my chair, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Nathan had seemed unhinged when I spoke to him during the restraining order proceedings, but this was something else entirely. "Eleanor, listen to me. I understand that you're scared, but there's no evidence that Nathan has done anything to Eric. Curses aren't real. Whatever is happening to Eric, it's a medical issue, and the doctors will figure it out." She looked at me with a mix of anger and desperation. "You don't believe me," she said, her voice breaking. "But I know what I saw. I know what he did. Please, detective, you have to help me. You have to stop him before it's too late." I sighed and rubbed my temples, feeling a headache coming on. "I'll look into it, Eleanor. But I can't promise anything. If there's no evidence of a crime, there's nothing I can do." She nodded, her eyes filled with a glimmer of hope. "Thank you, detective. Please just find him. Talk to him. Make him stop." With that, she stood up and left my office, leaving me with a sinking feeling in my gut. I didn't believe in curses, but there was something about the way she spoke, the fear in her eyes, that made me uneasy. Nathan Carlisle hadn't always been the kind of man who would consider something as drastic as a curse. He had once been a gentle soul, an artist who saw beauty in everything around him. He spent his days painting landscapes, capturing the world in vibrant colors on canvas. He loved his wife, Eleanor, more than anything, and for years they had been happy. They had met in college, both of them young and full of dreams. She was studying literature and he was in the art program. They had bonded over their love of stories. He painted them and she wrote them. They moved in together after graduation, and it wasn't long before they married. Their life together was simple but fulfilling. They bought a small house on the outskirts of the city, and Nathan turned the attic into his studio. They had talked about starting a family someday, but there was no rush. They were happy just being together. But over time, things began to change. Eleanor grew restless. She took a job at a publishing house, working long hours, coming home late, and often exhausted. Nathan supported her, encouraged her to pursue her career, but he could feel her slipping away from him. She became distant, her laughter less frequent, her smiles forced. He tried to reach her to bridge the growing gap between them, but it felt like she was always just out of reach. Then one day he found out about Eric. It was an accident. He hadn't meant to see the messages. But her phone had been left on the kitchen counter, and the screen lit up with a text from Eric. "I can't wait to see you tonight. I love you." Nathan felt his heart shatter. The ground beneath his feet seemed to give way, and he was falling, unable to catch himself. He confronted her that night, hoping for an explanation, hoping that somehow this wasn't what it seemed. But she didn't deny it. She simply looked at him, her eyes empty of regret, and said it was something she needed, something he couldn't give her. He begged her to end it. He told her he still loved her, that they could make it work, that they could find a way to move past this. But she refused. She said she loved Eric, that he made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. And that was the moment something broke inside of Nathan. He stopped painting. The attic studio, once filled with light and color, became a dark, empty space. He spent his days in a daze, unable to focus, unable to think of anything but Eleanor and Eric. He imagined them together, laughing, touching, loving, and it filled him with a rage he had never known. He wanted to hurt Eric, wanted to make him pay for what he had taken from him. But he didn't know how until he remembered the stories. Nathan's grandmother had been a strange woman. She had lived in a small cottage deep in the woods, and as a child, Nathan had spent summers with her, listening to her stories of magic and curses, of spirits that could be called upon to right wrongs. She had taught him about the old ways, how to make offerings, how to speak the words that would call the spirits to him. He had never taken her seriously, had always thought her stories were just that, stories. But now, in his desperation, he found himself thinking back to those summers, to the things she had taught him. He began to research, spending hours online, searching for anything that could give him the power he needed. He found forums, chat rooms, places where people spoke of dark rituals, of curses that could bring ruin to those who deserved it. He found an old book, hidden away in the dusty corners of the internet, a book that spoke of rituals and incantations, of offerings that could bind a curse to a soul. It took him days to gather everything he needed: a jar, a photograph of Eric, a knife. He worked in the dead of night, the house silent around him, his hands shaking as he followed the instructions, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke the words. He poured his hatred into the ritual, his anger, his pain. He offered his own blood, cutting his palm and letting it drip into the jar, mixing with the other ingredients. He sealed it with wax, chanting the final words, feeling something shift in the air around him. When it was done, he felt empty, like he had given a piece of himself away. But he also felt something else, something dark and powerful, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He knew deep down that he had done something terrible, something that couldn't be undone. It had been 2 weeks since Eleanor had come to my office, and I hadn't heard from her since. I assumed she had come to her senses, realized how absurd her accusations were. But then I got the call. Detective Harper? The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, tense. "This is Dr. Patel from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling about a patient, Eric Loran. He's been asking for you." I frowned, confused. Why would he be asking for me? He says he needs to speak to you about a curse. He mentioned your name specifically. I felt a chill run down my spine. "I'll be there as soon as I can." Eric Loran looked like a ghost of the man he must have once been. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, his body frail and weak. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and desperation, his voice barely a whisper. "He did this," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Nathan. He put a curse on me." I pulled up a chair, leaning in closer. "Eric, curses aren't real. Whatever's happening to you, it must be a medical condition." "No," he insisted, his voice shaking. "You don't understand. I can feel it. It's like something is eating away at me from the inside. The doctors can't explain it. They say there's nothing physically wrong with me, but I'm dying. I know I am. Eric's condition had deteriorated rapidly in the last few days. The doctors at St. Mary's were baffled, unable to find any medical explanation for his failing health. He had been admitted with symptoms that initially seemed like a severe flu fever, body aches, fatigue. But then his organs began shutting down one by one. Tests revealed nothing conclusive, and despite their best efforts, the doctors were powerless to stop his decline. As I sat beside his bed, Eric's hand, now skeletal and weak, gripped mine with a surprising amount of strength. "Detective," he croaked, "you have to find Nathan. He did this to me. I know how it sounds, but I'm not crazy. He said he would make me pay for being with Eleanor, and now I'm dying." I could see the terror in his eyes, the genuine belief that something beyond reason was at play. His once vibrant demeanor had been stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell of a man who seemed to be clinging to his last threads of hope. "Eric, I promise I'll look into this," I said, trying to offer some comfort, though I still had my doubts. Curses? Black magic? It was difficult to take seriously, but there was something about the way Eric spoke, the fear that gripped him, that I couldn't ignore. While Eric lay in the hospital, Eleanor's desperation grew. She had taken leave from work, unable to focus on anything but the worsening condition of her lover. She spent her days at the hospital, sitting by his side, watching helplessly as he withered away. The man she loved, the man she had chosen over her husband, was slipping through her fingers, and she felt powerless to stop it. She tried to reach out to Nathan, calling his phone, leaving voicemails, pleading for him to stop whatever he was doing. She even went to their old house, hoping to find him there, but it was empty. The attic studio where he once painted was now dark and cold, the canvases covered in dust, the brushes dry and brittle. It was as if Nathan had simply vanished. One night, as she sat by Eric's bedside, she felt a presence, a cold, oppressive feeling that made her skin prickle. She looked up, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw Nathan standing in the doorway, his eyes dark and empty, staring at her with a look of pure hatred. She blinked and he was gone, but the feeling remained, a sense of dread that settled deep in her bones. She knew she had to do something, anything, to save Eric. She began to research just as Nathan had done, searching for answers in the dark corners of the internet. She found forums where people spoke of curses, of dark magic, of rituals that could bind a soul and bring about its destruction. The more she read, the more she began to believe that Nathan had truly done something terrible, something that couldn't be undone. She found a post from someone who claimed to be able to break curses, to undo the damage that had been done. Desperate, she reached out, hoping against hope that there was still a chance to save Eric. It took me another week to track down Nathan. He had vanished, leaving no trace. No credit card transactions, no phone calls, nothing. Eventually, I found him living in a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, the air thick with the smell of mildew and despair. Nathan looked like a man who had lost everything. His once bright eyes were now dull and hollow, his face gaunt and unshaven. He didn't seem surprised to see me. In fact, it was almost as if he had been expecting me. "Detective Harper," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "I figured you'd come eventually." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. "Nathan, we need to talk about what's happening to Eric Loran." He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "I knew it would come to this. Did you do something to him?" I asked, my voice steady. "Did you put a curse on him?" He looked at me, his eyes empty. "I did what needed to be done. He took everything from me, my wife, my life. I had nothing left. So I made sure he'd lose everything too." "How?" I demanded. "How did you do it?" Nathan walked over to the small table by the window, picking up a jar, small, sealed with wax, dark liquid sloshing inside. "This," he said, holding it up. "This is his life. I bound it to this jar. As long as it exists, he will suffer." I felt a chill run down my spine, my stomach turning. "Nathan, this is insane. You need help." He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "It's too late for that, detective. It's done." Before I could react, he hurled the jar against the wall. The glass shattered, and the liquid splattered across the floor. Nathan let out a scream, a sound of pure anguish, of rage and despair, and collapsed to the ground. I rushed to his side, but it was too late. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, his body still. He was gone. That same night, Eric's condition took a sudden turn for the worse. The doctors had been hopeful that he was stabilizing, that perhaps whatever had been plaguing him was finally subsiding. But as the clock struck midnight, he began to seize, his body convulsing violently, his breathing ragged. Eleanor watched in horror, her heart pounding in her chest as the monitors around him began to blare. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room trying to stabilize him, but it was no use. Within minutes, Eric Laurent was gone. Eleanor let out a wail of grief, collapsing to the floor, her body shaking with sobs. The love of her life was gone, and there was nothing she could do to bring him back. The days that followed were a blur for Eleanor. She moved through them in a daze, barely eating, barely sleeping. The weight of her guilt was crushing. She had destroyed her marriage, betrayed the man who had loved her. And for what? For a love that had ended in tragedy. She couldn't shake the image of Nathan in the doorway of the hospital, the cold look in his eyes as he stared at her. She knew deep down that he had done this, that he had brought about Eric's death, and in doing so had destroyed himself as well. She returned to their old house one last time, standing in the attic studio, looking at the unfinished canvases that Nathan had left behind. She picked up one of his brushes, running her fingers over the bristles, and felt a pang of regret so deep it nearly brought her to her knees. Nathan had once been a gentle, loving man, and she had destroyed him. She had taken his love and thrown it away, and in doing so had unleashed a darkness that had consumed them all. She knew she couldn't stay. There was nothing left for her here. No love, no happiness, only the echoes of what once was. She packed a bag and left the city, leaving behind no forwarding address, no trace of where she was going. She wanted to disappear, to leave behind the pain and the memories that haunted her. I still think about that night, about the look in Nathan's eyes, the hatred that had consumed him. I don't know if I believe in curses, but I do know that hate is a powerful thing. Powerful enough to destroy not just the person it's aimed at, but the one who holds it. I've seen a lot of things in my years as a detective: violence, betrayal, the darkest sides of human nature. But there was something about this case, something about the way Nathan spoke, the emptiness in his eyes that has stayed with me. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and the darkness creeps in, I hear the sound of that jar shattering, echoing in my mind. I see Nathan's face twisted with rage and pain, and I wonder if in his final moments he realized what he had done. If he understood that the hatred he had held onto for so long had destroyed not just Eric, but himself as well. I think about Eleanor, about the choices she made, the way she had torn apart her own life and the lives of those around her. I wonder if she found peace wherever she ended up, or if the weight of her guilt still haunts her as it haunts me. In the end, there are no winners in a story like this. Only broken hearts, shattered lives, and the echoes of betrayal that linger long after the people who caused them are gone. If you were in Nathan's position, discovering the betrayal of a loved one, would you forgive, walk away, or do something that might change all your lives forever?
That's the story I've shared with you today. If you enjoyed it, make sure to check out my playlist for more similar stories.